In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where manicured lawns stretched endlessly and white picket fences lined the streets, life seemed almost too perfect. The air carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass, and children could often be seen riding their bikes down winding roads or playing catch in cul-de-sacs. Willow Creek Estates was one of those gated communities that promised tranquility, safety, and exclusivity, a place where families could escape the chaos of city life. But beneath its polished surface, tensions simmered like an invisible storm waiting to break. The Thompson family had only recently moved into this upscale neighborhood, seeking a fresh start after years of frequent relocations due to Mark's demanding career as a Navy SEAL. Now retired, Mark wanted nothing more than to provide stability for his teenage son, Jake. With its tree-lined streets and friendly neighbors waving from their porches, Willow Creek seemed like the ideal spot to build a peaceful future. However, it didn't take long for them to realize that not everything here was as serene as it appeared. Almost immediately, they noticed how seriously everyone took the Homeowners Association (HOA) rules. Flyers taped to mailboxes reminded residents to keep noise levels low, especially after sunset. Neighbors whispered about someone who had been fined for painting their front door an unapproved shade of blue. At first, Mark chuckled at the absurdity of it all. He'd spent years navigating far more dangerous situations overseas. Surely, he could handle a few nitpicky guidelines about lawn care and holiday decorations. But as weeks turned into months, he began to see why some people found the HOA's strictness oppressive. Jake, on the other hand, loved the sense of order. As a shy teenager still adjusting to yet another new school, he appreciated the predictability of life in Willow Creek. Every evening, he'd sit by the window doing homework while watching squirrels dart across the yard or listening to the distant hum of conversations drifting through open windows. It was during one of these quiet nights that Jake overheard something unusual, a heated argument between two neighbors about late-night music blaring from a backyard party. One voice accused the other of being a snitch, while the second defended themselves by saying they were just following HOA regulations. Mark, overhearing snippets of the exchange, shook his head. "People get worked up over the strangest things," he muttered under his breath. Still, he couldn't deny the unease creeping into his mind. There was something unsettling about how much power the HOA wielded, dictating even the smallest details of daily life. And then there were the rumors, whispers circulating online about mysterious figures patrolling the streets late at night, claiming to enforce HOA rules. Some dismissed them as paranoid fantasies, but others swore they'd seen these so-called enforcers lurking around dark corners, dressed in tactical gear and carrying flashlights. For now, the Thompsons tried to shrug it off. After all, what harm could come from living in such a picturesque neighborhood? Mark figured if anything happened, he'd deal with it when the time came. What he didn't know was that trouble wouldn't knock politely on his door. It would come crashing in without warning, shattering the illusion of peace and forcing him to confront dangers far greater than any HOA fine. Jake Thompson had always been curious by nature, a trait that often led him down rabbit holes of online forums and social media threads. One evening, while scrolling through his phone, he stumbled upon a post in a private Facebook group for Willow Creek Estates residents. The post was titled, "Has anyone else seen these HOA enforcement officers?" Intrigued, Jake clicked on it and began reading. The original poster described an unsettling encounter late one night when two men dressed in what looked like tactical uniforms approached her house. They claimed to be investigating a noise complaint but refused to show any official identification. When she asked them to leave, they lingered outside her property for nearly 20 minutes before driving off. Her story sparked a flurry of comments from other neighbors, some sharing similar experiences, while others dismissed the claims as paranoia or exaggeration. One neighbor wrote, "I saw them last week near the clubhouse. They were wearing vests with Willow Creek HOA enforcement printed on them, but something felt off. Like who gives random people tactical gear just to check if someone's music is too loud?" Another chimed in, saying, My husband talked to our HOA president about this, and she said there's no such thing as enforcement officers. These guys are probably imposters trying to scare us into compliance. As Jake scrolled further, he noticed photos posted by different residents, blurry images taken at odd angles, showing figures in dark clothing standing near streetlights or parked cars. None of the pictures were clear enough to identify faces, but the uniforms appeared consistent. Black shirts, cargo pants, and vests adorned with patches. It all seemed so strange. Why would anyone go to such lengths just to enforce rules about lawn decorations or quiet hours? Feeling uneasy, Jake showed the post to his dad. Mark glanced at the screen briefly before shaking his head. "Sounds like nonsense," he said dismissively. "Probably bored teenagers messing around or some overzealous neighbors playing cop." But deep down, Mark couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. He'd spent years relying on gut instincts during high-stakes missions, and now those same instincts whispered warnings in the back of his mind. Over dinner, Jake pressed his dad for answers. What if it's true, though? What if these guys really are out there pretending to work for the HOA? Shouldn't we do something about it? Mark sighed, setting down his fork. "Look, I get why you're worried," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But until we know more, there's not much we can do. Just stay alert, okay? If you see anything suspicious, let me know right away." Despite Mark's reassurances, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the post. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he replayed the stories in his head. What if the fake officers showed up at their house? Would his dad handle it? Or worse, what if they weren't fakes at all but actual criminals using the HOA as a cover? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Meanwhile, Mark sat in the living room, flipping through channels without really paying attention. His mind kept drifting back to the post and the grainy photos Jake had shown him earlier. Something about the whole situation rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was nothing, just harmless theatrics by overzealous neighbors. But what if it wasn't? Years of training had taught him never to underestimate potential threats, no matter how unlikely they seemed. For now, all he could do was keep an eye out and trust his instincts. Little did he know, those instincts would soon be put to the test in ways he couldn't have imagined. It was the kind of night that seemed almost too quiet, the kind where even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Mark Thompson had just settled into bed after a long day, his thoughts still lingering on the strange rumors Jake had shown him earlier. He wasn't one to lose sleep over speculation, but something about those so-called HOA enforcement officers gnawed at the edges of his mind. Still, he figured it was nothing more than neighborhood gossip, until the sound of car doors slamming jolted him awake. The clock on the nightstand read 3:07 a.m. The house was dark and silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Mark's heart quickened as he sat up, straining to listen. Another noise followed, a metallic clang, like someone testing the strength of his front gate. His military instincts kicked in immediately. Whoever was outside wasn't here for a casual visit. Slipping out of bed, Mark moved quietly to the window, careful not to make a sound. Peering through the blinds, he saw two figures standing near the driveway. They wore black tactical gear, their vests emblazoned with bold white lettering. Willow Creek HOA Enforcement. One carried a flashlight, its beam cutting sharply through the darkness, while the other held what looked like a crowbar. Both men scanned the property with purpose, their movements deliberate and calculated. Mark's jaw tightened. This wasn't a routine check or a friendly reminder about lawn maintenance. These weren't ordinary neighbors, or even real HOA representatives. Something about their demeanor screamed danger. Years of experience told him they were either deeply delusional or outright criminals using the guise of authority to intimidate homeowners. Either way, he wasn't going to let them get away with it. Reaching under his bed, Mark retrieved the handgun he kept there, loaded and ready in case of emergencies. It wasn't the first time he relied on his training to protect his family, and he doubted it would be the last. Moving swiftly but silently, he positioned himself near the front door, keeping low and out of sight. From upstairs, he heard Jake stirring, likely woken by the commotion outside. Mark whispered a quick prayer, hoping his son would stay put and safe. The pounding came moments later, a sharp, aggressive knock that echoed through the house. "Open up." One of the men barked, his voice muffled but commanding. "We're here on behalf of the HOA. We've received reports of disturbances coming from this property." Mark didn't respond. Instead, he steadied his breathing, gripping the firearm firmly in his hands. He knew better than to open the door without verifying who was on the other side. Fake uniforms and vague threats weren't enough to fool him. If these men truly believed they could bully their way into his home, they were about to learn the hard way how wrong they were. When no answer came, the man raised his voice. "Sir, we have reason to believe you're violating community guidelines. Open the door now, or we'll be forced to take action." As if to emphasize his point, the second figure stepped forward and began prying at the doorframe with the crowbar. The metallic scrape sent chills down Mark's spine, but he remained calm, his focus razor-sharp. Without hesitation, Mark fired a single warning shot into the air. The sharp crack of the gunshot shattered the silence, reverberating through the neighborhood like thunder. Startled, the two men froze, exchanging panicked glances before retreating several steps. "Leave my property immediately," Mark shouted, his voice steady and authoritative. "You're trespassing, and I won't hesitate to defend myself and my son." For a moment, it seemed like they might comply. But instead of leaving entirely, they regrouped, muttering angrily to each other as they circled toward the side of the house. Mark's pulse raced. They weren't giving up, not yet. Clenching his jaw, he grabbed his phone and dialed 911, keeping one eye trained on the intruders. Whatever they wanted, they weren't getting it. Not tonight. Not ever. The warning shot hung in the air like a thunderclap, silencing the night and sending a clear message. Mark Thompson wasn't someone to be trifled with. For a split second, the two men froze, their flashlights casting jittery beams across the front yard. Then, realizing they'd underestimated their target, they scrambled backward, muttering curses under their breath. But instead of retreating entirely, they regrouped near the side of the house, their movements hurried but calculated. Mark stayed low, his heart pounding as he listened intently. He could hear them whispering, their voices tense and agitated. One of them suggested trying another entrance, while the other argued that they should cut their losses and leave. It was obvious they hadn't expected resistance, let alone armed resistance, and now panic was setting in. Still, Mark knew better than to assume they'd give up. People who broke into homes in the dead of night didn't back down easily, especially when pride or desperation was involved. From upstairs, Jake's voice trembled through the darkness. "Dad, what's happening?" "Stay where you are," Mark replied firmly, keeping his tone steady to avoid alarming his son further. "Lock your bedroom door and stay away from the windows." Jake didn't argue. He trusted his dad completely, even if fear gripped him like an icy hand. Mark allowed himself a brief moment of relief, knowing his son was safe. For now. But there was no time to dwell on it. The intruders were still out there, and he needed to stay one step ahead. Peering cautiously through the blinds, Mark watched as one of the men crept toward the side gate leading to the backyard. The other lingered near the corner of the house, shining his flashlight intermittently to scout for movement. Their tactics were sloppy compared to the precision Mark had seen during his years in the Navy SEALs, but that didn't make them any less dangerous. Desperation had a way of turning amateurs reckless, and reckless people made mistakes that could cost lives. Mark moved quickly, positioning himself near the kitchen window, which overlooked the backyard. If they tried to break in through the sliding glass door, he'd have a clear line of sight. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket. It was the 911 operator confirming that police were en route. Mark whispered a quick update about the situation, careful not to raise his voice too high. "They're attempting to circle the house," he said. "2 suspects, possibly armed. Advise officers to approach with caution." As he spoke, A loud crash echoed from the living room. One of the men had thrown something heavy, a rock, maybe, at the front window, shattering the glass. Shards scattered across the floor, glinting faintly in the moonlight. Mark cursed under his breath, but didn't budge from his position. He couldn't afford to expose himself yet, not until he knew exactly what they were planning next. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out. This time, it wasn't Mark's weapon. Startled, he realized it must have come from one of the intruders, though whether it was intentional or accidental was unclear. Either way, the sound sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. He shouted again, louder this time. "You've been reported to the police. Leave now, or you'll face serious consequences." His words seemed to rattle them. The man at the side gate hesitated, glancing nervously over his shoulder, as if expecting sirens to appear at any moment. His partner, however, doubled down, shouting threats and continuing to prowl around the perimeter. "You think we're scared of cops?" he yelled, his voice laced with bravado, masking thinly veiled fear. "We're just doing our job." Mark ignored the taunts, focusing instead on maintaining control of the situation. He knew how these things worked. When criminals felt cornered, they often resorted to intimidation tactics. But Mark had faced far worse than some imposter thugs in tactical gear. He tightened his grip on his firearm, ready to act if necessary. Minutes stretched like hours, each second heavier than the last. Finally, distant sirens pierced the night, growing louder with every passing moment. The intruders exchanged panicked looks before bolting toward their car, leaving behind a trail of chaos. As tires screeched and gravel sprayed, Mark exhaled slowly, lowering his weapon but staying alert. The danger wasn't gone, not entirely, but help was finally on the way. And for the first time since the ordeal began, he allowed himself to believe they might actually get through this unscathed. The wail of approaching sirens cut through the tension like a knife, their shrill cry echoing down the quiet streets of Willow Creek Estates. Mark remained vigilant, his weapon still in hand, but pointed safely downward as he watched the intruder's car speed away into the night. For a moment, he considered giving chase. His instincts screamed at him to finish what he'd started. But reason won out. These men were dangerous, yes, but reckless enough to leave behind clues that could lead the authorities straight to them. Besides, Jake was upstairs, shaken and scared, and Mark's first priority had always been his son. As the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the front yard, Mark stepped cautiously onto the porch, raising one hand to signal the officers while keeping the other firmly on his firearm. He didn't want there to be any misunderstandings. These were tense times, and he knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. "I'm Mark Thompson," he called out calmly. "I'm unarmed now and need to speak with you." The police arrived in force. 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt at the curb, followed by an unmarked vehicle moments later. Officers spilled out, guns drawn, scanning the area for immediate threats. Once they confirmed the suspects were gone, they lowered their weapons and approached Mark. One officer introduced himself as Detective Harris, his expression grim but professional. "Mr. Thompson, can you tell us what happened here tonight?" Mark recounted everything. The strange rumors about fake HOA enforcers, the unexpected appearance of the 2 men at his door, their refusal to identify themselves properly, and the escalating confrontation that culminated in gunfire. He spoke clearly and concisely, careful not to embellish or omit details. Years of military training had taught him the importance of precision under pressure, and tonight was no exception. Detective Harris listened intently, jotting notes as Mark described the intruder's appearance and behavior. When asked about evidence, Mark gestured toward the broken window and shattered glass littering the living room floor. "They tried forcing their way inside," he explained. "When I fired a warning shot, they retreated but kept circling the house. That's when one of them accidentally discharged their weapon." He pointed to the hole in the wall where the stray bullet had lodged itself after ricocheting off furniture. The damage served as a stark reminder of just how close things had come to spiraling completely out of control. Jake emerged from upstairs, pale but composed, clutching a blanket around his shoulders. Seeing his son safe brought a wave of relief over Mark, though it also reignited his anger toward the men who had put them both in harm's way. Detective Harris gently questioned Jake, ensuring he was okay before asking if he'd noticed anything unusual earlier in the evening. Jake nodded hesitantly, recounting how he'd read posts online about similar incidents involving fake HOA officers. His testimony added weight to Mark's account, reinforcing the idea that this wasn't an isolated event, but part of a disturbing pattern. While detectives began processing the scene, another officer discovered a crucial piece of evidence near the driveway: a discarded jacket bearing the same Willow Creek HOA enforcement insignia the intruders had worn. Inside the pocket was a crumpled receipt from a local gas station, dated earlier that day. Even more promising was the partial license plate captured on Mark's security camera, a grainy but usable image that might help track down the getaway car. By the time the initial investigation wrapped up, dawn was breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. Neighbors who had been roused by the commotion gathered cautiously at the edges of the property, whispering among themselves. Some expressed concern, others gawked openly. Mark ignored them all, focusing instead on comforting Jake and answering follow-up questions from the police. Though exhausted, Mark felt a flicker of hope. They had evidence. They had witnesses. And most importantly, they had proof that the so-called HOA enforcers weren't untouchable ghosts lurking in the shadows. They were real people, flawed and vulnerable to justice. As the sun rose higher, casting light on the shattered remnants of his once peaceful home, Mark vowed silently that whoever these men were, they wouldn't escape accountability. Not on his watch. The investigation into the break-in at the Thompson home quickly gained momentum, spurred by the mounting evidence left behind by the intruders. The discarded jacket with its falsified Willow Creek HOA enforcement insignia became a key piece of the puzzle. Forensic teams dusted it for fingerprints and found several partial prints that matched records in local law enforcement databases. Meanwhile, the grainy but usable image of the getaway car's license plate, captured on Mark's security camera, led investigators to a vehicle registered under a fake name. Digging deeper, they traced the registration to a small storage unit rented under yet another alias. Inside the storage unit, police uncovered an unsettling trove of items: more tactical vests, patches identical to those worn during the break-in, and even counterfeit badges designed to mimic official law enforcement insignias. There were also handwritten notes detailing addresses within Willow Creek estates, some marked with cryptic notations like noise complaint or landscaping violation. It was clear these men weren't just random troublemakers. They had been systematically targeting residents, using the guise of HOA authority to intimidate and bully. As detectives pieced together the evidence, a chilling motive emerged. The two suspects turned out to be former residents of Willow Creek Estates who had been evicted years earlier after repeated violations of HOA rules. Their bitterness had festered over time, transforming into a twisted desire for revenge against the community they believed had wronged them. Posing as enforcers allowed them to exploit the very system they despised, instilling fear among their former neighbors while avoiding suspicion. What started as petty harassment escalated into something far darker, a dangerous game of power and control. News of the arrest spread rapidly through the neighborhood, sparking shockwaves of disbelief and outrage. Residents gathered for an emergency HOA meeting, where emotions ran high. Some expressed guilt for not taking earlier reports of suspicious activity seriously enough, while others demanded stricter measures to prevent similar incidents in the future. The president of the HOA issued a public apology, acknowledging that the organization's strict rules might have inadvertently created an environment ripe for abuse. She promised reforms, including clearer communication channels and partnerships with local law enforcement to ensure resident safety. For Mark and Jake, life in Willow Creek Estates would never feel quite the same again. While relieved that the perpetrators had been caught, they couldn't shake the lingering unease of knowing how easily chaos could invade their once idyllic world. Neighbors began approaching Mark with gratitude, praising him for his bravery and quick thinking. But the attention came with mixed feelings. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a father doing whatever it took to protect his family. Jake, too, found himself changed by the ordeal. Overnight, he'd gone from being an ordinary teenager to someone whose dad had stared down armed intruders. Friends at school bombarded him with questions, eager to hear every detail of the dramatic night. At first, Jake felt awkward recounting the story, but over time, he realized it gave him a newfound sense of pride, not because of the violence, but because of how his dad handled the situation with calm determination. It made him appreciate the sacrifices Mark had made throughout his life, both as a Navy SEAL and as a single parent. Media outlets picked up the story, turning it into a cautionary tale about vigilance and accountability in gated communities. Reporters interviewed Mark, who used the platform to stress the importance of verifying authority figures and understanding one's rights when confronted by anyone claiming to represent an organization. He emphasized that while self-defense was sometimes necessary, prevention required collective effort. Neighbors looking out for each other, questioning inconsistencies, and refusing to let fear dictate their actions. Despite the whirlwind of attention, Mark remained grounded. For him, the real victory wasn't catching the criminals. It was ensuring his son grew up in a safer, stronger community. And though the scars of that chaotic night would always linger, they served as reminders of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a father and his child. As the dust settled, one thing was certain. The Thompsons had faced the storm head-on, emerging stronger than ever, and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. In the weeks following the arrest of the fake HOA enforcers, life in Willow Creek Estates began to settle back into its usual rhythm, but with noticeable changes. The once rigid and impersonal atmosphere of the neighborhood softened as residents started reaching out to one another more often. Neighbors who had previously exchanged only polite nods now shared coffee on porches or stopped to chat about their kids' soccer games. Mark noticed this shift during his morning walks, feeling a sense of camaraderie he hadn't expected when they first moved in. People seemed less focused on rules and more concerned with building trust within the community. For Jake, the experience became a defining moment in his teenage years. He went from being the new kid to someone everyone knew and respected. Friends at school still teased him good-naturedly about having the superhero dad, but beneath the jokes was genuine admiration. More importantly, Jake found himself growing closer to Mark, seeing him not just as a parent but as a role model. The late-night conversations they'd had since the incident revealed layers of his father's personality he hadn't fully understood before: the discipline, the calm under pressure, and the deep love that motivated every decision. It gave Jake a new perspective on resilience and responsibility. Mark, too, felt a renewed sense of purpose. After years of putting others' safety ahead of his own while serving in the Navy SEALs, he'd sometimes struggled to adjust to civilian life. But defending his home against intruders reminded him that his skills weren't confined to distant battlefields. They could make a difference right where he lived. Inspired by the attention his story received, Mark began volunteering at local schools and community centers, teaching workshops on personal safety and conflict resolution. His message was simple: preparation and awareness can prevent small problems from turning into big ones. Meanwhile, the HOA implemented sweeping reforms to restore faith in its leadership. Residents were invited to participate in monthly meetings, ensuring transparency and accountability. A new hotline was established for reporting suspicious activity, staffed by trained professionals rather than relying solely on anonymous tips. Security cameras were installed at key entry points, monitored around the clock to deter future incidents. These measures didn't erase all concerns overnight, but they signaled a clear commitment to change, and that made a world of difference. As spring arrived, bringing blooming flowers and longer days, the Thompsons found themselves embracing their new normal. One Saturday afternoon, Jake joined his dad in the backyard, helping build a raised garden bed, a project Mark had been talking about for months, but never got around to starting. As they worked side by side, laughter mingling with the sound of hammering nails, Mark couldn't help but feel grateful. Grateful for their second chance, for the lessons learned, and for the strength they discovered together. The scars of that chaotic night would always remain, both literal and emotional, but they no longer defined the family. Instead, they served as reminders of what truly mattered, standing up for what's right, protecting those you love, and finding light even in the darkest moments. And though the drama of that night faded into memory, its legacy endured, not as a tale of fear, but as a testament to courage, unity, and hope. For the Thompsons, Willow Creek Estates wasn't just a place to live anymore. It was home.